Good afternoon. I'm very glad and honored to be able to introduce you today, Professor Dr. Terry Anderson from the University of Athabasca in Canada, who is visiting us, staying during more than a week in the program of Internationalization at Home that has been funded by La Caixa, and in which the eLearn Center of the Universitat Oberta of Catalunya is developing several visits of people, specialists, experts in online and e-learning from all over the world, in order to identify which are the main trends of online learning for the very next future. Today, Professor Anderson is going to talk to us about connectivism. I'm not going to introduce the term because he is going to do it, and probably much better than me. But I would like to introduce you, Professor Anderson, as one of the most highlighting people related to online learning. Professor Anderson started working for a long time in the University of Alberta in Canada, in which he is born there, and 11 years ago started to work at Athabasca University. Athabasca University is an open and distance university in Canada, a big one, a large one, and with a lot of experience doing first distance education and later on moving from distance education to online education. I mean, moving from correspondence models of distance education to online and e-learning models of distance education too. Professor Anderson has worked with a lot of students. He's participating in a master's on distance education, and a PhD also on distance education, and have worked in several countries all over the world with a lot of foreign students. So also the idea of internationalization, of cross-cultural issues about the online teaching and learning are one of the important things that we can talk to him to. He wrote the book, he edited the book because I think there was other authors contributing too, that it's called Theory and Practice of Online Learning, that has been one of the most important books referring about this online education panorama, because we needed such a kind of theory about that, because there were a lot of them. But I would also like to highlight the fact that Professor Anderson also wrote with Randy Garrison another book that was called eLearning in the 20th century, in the 21st century, and in which he presented the ideas about the community of inquiry, in which most of the people who is taking responsibility of organizing collaborative learning, even not only for learners but also for teachers, are basing most of their work. Well, for us it's very important, the visit of Professor Anderson, because we consider that we are working at a distance, but in fact together, in the sense that most of our developments has taken into consideration what Terry Anderson wrote, what he said in other conferences and so on. So I think that it could be very interesting, the speech that Terry is going to give us, and to discuss about the concept of connectivism too. So the idea, the title was agreed in the sense of giving something in order to discuss. So we talk about which is the sexiest title for this conference, in the sense of how we can attract people in order to discuss about it. So anything is done, everything can be discussed, but first of all, let's go to listen to Professor Anderson. And thank you, really thank you very, very much for staying with us, for attending to this lecture, and obviously for visiting for the first time Barcelona. We hope that you will enjoy it too. Thank you.
as I said, I will tell you the answer right off the bat is that there is no perfect pedagogy, but I'm going to go through the major pedagogies that are used in distance education or online learning, and we'll see. I think our challenge is to figure out what mix of pedagogy and what mix of technology and how to make them work together most effectively. One slide on Athabasca. It is in northern Alberta, in the west near the Rocky Mountains in Canada, and as you can, Albert said most of those things, but and it is not a huge university. The university itself is located in a town of 4,000 people, so it's way out in the middle of the bush. But I live in a city called Edmonton, about 1 million people, 160 kilometers south of that. Okay, I always usually start out talks by thinking and getting people to think about their values of why are you into education and what are the values that sort of drive you as an individual. And when I think of them, the three that come out most strongly for me is the fact that we can do a lot better in education than we have been doing. And almost any profession, if you talk to lawyers or dentists or doctors or engineers, and you say, well, do you teach or do you practice the same way you did 10 years or 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Do you use the same tools? Do you use the same measurement things? And they say, well, no, that's so old-fashioned. But when education, we seem to have got hung up on the way education was done 150 years ago. And there's many of us as educators who think that if you can get 30 people in a room, that's the perfect way to do education. We can't get any better. And I just think that we can improve not only the quality, but the efficiency, because I think we waste a lot of students' time and a lot of our own time. And I'm really interested in the theme of the eLearn Center on time, because I think it's a critical issue for all of us. Because until the eLab invents virtual time and gives us 48 hours a day, there's always going to be a problem with time, I think. So the second is to talk about student control and student freedom, the fact that students get way more choices than they have ever had, way more production tools, and if we don't start to exploit those tools, we will become more and more irrelevant. And the day when we could control what students want and where they go and what they do and how they think has long since passed. So it makes it much more challenging for us to make sure that we're always thinking about their position and their lifelong learning. And then finally, I just don't think our current system is scalable to meet the world demand, especially at the graduate level. We just cannot afford to build the universities, to hire the professors for all the people who need it. So we have to do more effective and more efficient ways to run. And this is from a book by a couple of Americans, McNeely and Wolverton, and they talk about how institutions are sort of created by societies, but at the same time, the institution creates the society. And they talk about 6 institutions that have really had an impact, and the first being the Library of Alexandria, then the medieval monastery, and the emergence of the classical university in Bologna and Paris and Cambridge and Oxford. And then the sort of the American and influence on the institution of letters, where people wrote and discoursed, the sort of amateur scientist kind of an era, followed by the disciplines, including the modern ones like women's studies, and finally the laboratory. And all of those or all of those 6, were ways that institutions that arose to help us to comprehend knowledge, to classify it, to propagate it, and to develop it. And I think what you'll find is that none of these are really adapted for an e-learning or a networked environment. And I think we need to build new institutions to do that, or drastically change some of our own. And I think the work that you're doing here, and hopefully we will at Athabasca, are really leading the edge in the development. But in order to develop institutions that really make a difference, we have to have pedagogies and tools and technologies, and that's what I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of those pedagogies. And the challenge is, do our net-based institutions, what do they look like, what should they look like, and do our pedagogies match that context? So if you talk about distance education, there's been many people have had arguments about and classified things about the generations of distance education. And the classic ones are you start with correspondence, and then you go to broadcast technologies, and then you go to network technologies, the first, second, and third. But the problem with those kind of definitions is that they're dependent upon technologies. And technologies shouldn't be the drivers because we end up becoming then focused, I think, too much on the machines and on the hard technologies rather than the way the technologies are used. So I rejected that kind of way of thinking about generations of technology. But I'm not saying that technology isn't really important, because all of these technologies, whether you think it's like up at the top where the guy is cranking in books and injecting it into students' heads, or modern forms on the bottom, or even the technology of classes and books, or the technology of just sitting around a fountain and talking to a grand guru. These are all technologies that are being used to aid and assist learning. So you can't talk about technology without talking about pedagogy, and you can't talk about pedagogy without talking about technology, even though the technologies may be quite simple. And so I wrote an article a couple of years ago and said how learning is a dance where really technology sets the beat and the time and how fast, but it's the pedagogy that has the moves and the twirls and the twists and adds the excitement to the beat. So I've sort of written an article, and I'll give you the reference later, talking about 3 generations of e-learning pedagogy, or you could say distance education pedagogy. And just like the technology of books hasn't gone away in e-learning, or in none of these generations has completely made the earlier one irrelevant or not used. All 3 of these are being used, and the technology is enhancing each one of them, and hopefully the pedagogy based on each one of those is improving as well. So I'll go through them rather quickly, and then we'll concentrate on the last one because it's the least familiar. So the first one is behavioral or pedagogical pedagogies. And I was born in the city of Calgary, which has the world famous rodeo, the Calgary Stampede, where the people go on horses and rope and torture animals and have a good time doing all that sort of cowboy stuff. And cowboys, they really like things direct, like keep it simple. Like cowboy poetry is just, love, and it's been lonesome in the saddle since my horse died, all of those kind of really simple kind of stories. And there's an expression we use in English is that good teaching, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And that's the way a lot of people think that that's clear and simple, and it led to the theories on direct instruction, which are still predominant in training in some training institutions. But you can't get away as an academic and being a cowboy. They just don't go together very well. So Robert Gagne wrote the events of instruction, and he added, you see how the words are much bigger here, but the ideas are a lot the same. You gain their attention, you tell them the objectives, you stimulate the recall. These are all things that if you went to teacher school at the same time I did, this is what proper instructional design was all about. And it's still being used in a lot of training institutes today. And it's the basis for instructional systems design, which if you take an instructional technology or learning design, you always end up studying these kind of lockstep way to produce education. But again, when the cognitive revolution came along, we started thinking that that's really too simple, and that there's more to things like, well, what do we do about motivation, and what do we do about the way people think and the processes in the mind, and how much working memory and short and long-term memory. And we started thinking of the brain as being like a computer with being able to function that way, and used that as a model. And then we got into things like how much load can you put on a student, and not to make sure that you're not distracting students with too many representations of the same content. We started realizing that students get bored, and you had to have variability. You couldn't do the same thing over and over and over again. And the multimedia started coming in. And so I've lumped these two together because they kind of merged, and it's become the basis for up until the start of the maybe 1995. This was what we were taught at teacher school, and what was taught to be an instructional designer. There's an epistemological basis for this kind of pedagogy, and that is a basic assumption that you can teach people different things, and that your job is just to make it logically coherent. It doesn't really worry about perspective, because knowledge is a true thing outside of cultural influences, and it is capable of being transmitted. And it works well with the scientific method, because you assume that all of the inputs you put in as a teacher will result in outputs that you can measure in some way or another. And so we had lots of emphasis on learning objectives. But it hasn't stopped at that time, because now we're starting to use that same pedagogy with new technologies, and we're starting to throw these onto the net. And one of the most interesting things that's come out of that is this idea of reflection, that as a person is going through a learning sequence, they can start to see what they did in the past. They can start to reflect on their own progress. We can get meters to show them where they're at. You can allow them to compare themselves to other learners to see how they have gone and what path they have made through the learning sequence. Because once you digitize all this stuff, it becomes capable of leaving footprints and traces and marks that we can mine. And then from those traces, we can develop customized, we can change the sequence of instruction, and we can spend longer on this part or on that part, depending upon the individual representation. So we get into this idea of creating student models that's not just for all students, but for one student. So we can, starting to reach out to that idea of getting people to, have an individualized learning experience. And we also started realizing from cognitive theory just how important competition and games and things like that were. So we're starting to see that come into distance education. And as I said, learning analytics is a really large thing, not just in education, but in companies, being able to track the monitoring of their sales and of their production and of their customers' behaviors. And there's a number of conferences that we've been leading at Athabasca. The next one's coming up in Vancouver next year, the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. And we've been getting some funding from the Gates Foundation and from other people, because this is seen as being a really promising area. And it's interesting to look at some of the colleges that, like Rio Salada College in Colorado, they say that within 8 days of a student registering, they get a probability of that student dropping out and not finishing the program. And then they have a whole bunch of interventions, from telephone calls to extra content to social visits, to try to be able to help and find out where these people are having trouble and to customize the education for them. So I think it's quite promising. And I was impressed at the University of Catalonia, the way your quality assurance gives you this kind of indicators of what's happening with your teachers, your tutors, and your counselors. And I think it was very impressive. And I think we're just at the start of that kind of data mining for learning. And this is one that is a technique that I don't know if you'd use, but it isn't strictly in line with behavioral cognitive necessarily, but this is, to me, if you don't get anything out of this talk, you should try marking essays using voice instead of typing, because for me, I'm not a very fast typist, and this really saves you a lot of time, and students love it. And the tools are right there. I use Adobe Acrobat. There are other tools that do it too. But if any of you have to do a lot of essay marking, you'll find that just talking, and it makes it so much more, increases teaching presence, because you get the voice, but you also can be your real self. Like if I'm marking by typing and I think, oh, this student should have this reference, then I have to go and find the reference and paste it in. But if I'm talking, I can say, oh, there's something by Brown, and just do a Google search and you'll find it. And so it saves me time and makes it a lot more casual. So it's not just for behavioral cognitivists, but I like to throw that slide in. one thing about cognitive behaviorism is that they really focus on content, and so many of the universities, the open universities, especially the Open University of the UK, they do all their own books and all their own teaching guides, and they spend 2 years, 3 years with a team of 20 people creating this perfect content, and that worked for a while. But the problem is that you get too much hung up on the style as equaling the content, so that you're sort of you're packaging everything in a style that is of questionable value. And this is a chart of Encarta, Microsoft's encyclopedia. And when they started to first design that product in 1985, they did some focus groups, and they asked potential customers how much would they pay for an encyclopedia that was as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica. And at that time, people were paying $2,000 or $3,000 for a full set of encyclopedias. So their first market projections was that they could sell that encyclopedia for $1,000 in 1985. And then by the time it was produced, I think in 1994, it was out at $147. And in 2009, they started giving it away, and now it's out of production. People will not pay for content anymore. There's so much content that if your pedagogy is designed on the perfect content, and there's content everywhere, instead of being a hard-to-find object, it's becoming, a giveaway object. And the giveaway is the open educational resources. And it's been interesting talking to some people here and to Alberta. Is there a sustainable model for open educational resources, and how is it going to work? And for sure, there's a lot of things we don't know, and we've had artificial stimulations from various foundations to get MIT and Carnegie Mellon and all those other guys producing content, but whether they will in the long run, we don't really know. But we have examples from the open source movement where people have had tremendous success. Linux, Apache, all of the Moodle, all of these tools that are built by people contributing together. And I think we can use that model to build content. And I'm sure you're familiar with Merlot or OER Commons. And there's a meeting. Just let me get to. I missed this. Where is it? Anyways, the Open Educational OER University is having its founding meetings tonight, and I was just watching them last night, and they're being streamed from New Zealand. But the idea there is that the missing piece is credentialing. Students, they want to learn, but they want to get a ticket. They want to get a degree or something like that. So the partners in the Open Educational Resource University are figuring out ways to assess, and to try to assess beyond just writing multiple choice tests, but to really see what competencies students have and to be able to give them credentials and degrees for it. And this is a little bit of a plug for our own press, but those are 5 of the 7 books now that we produce in the Emerging Issues in Distance Education series. And all of those books are available for free for download. And if you go to Athabasca University Press, you'll see, we have about 80 books there that, and all of them can be downloaded, or you can buy them in paper if you want. And as well, there's a plug for Erodal, the journal that I edit, and I hope that you subscribe to that because it's free, and the Canadian government gives us some money, and it's a lot dependent on how many people subscribe. So if you can, I'd love you to subscribe, and you can think of it as junk mail if you want, but at least I get the subscription. So, but I hope that if you subscribe, that means you get 4 or 5 emails a year from me telling me the table of contents. So, again, what the problem with us in distance education, so many of us have been, and teachers think that their job as a distance educator is to create content. And so if I use somebody else's content, then what's my job all about? Or am I worth it? Or am I going to be putting myself out of a job? And I think that this is definitely not the case, that we desperately need faculty members and graduate students to work with other faculty members to create more and better open educational resources, and to not get hung up on that I created everything and that's what I'm about, because we're supposed to be adding value, not just creating content. And I think that's what a big challenge that we have. So getting back to the behavioral, what are the adoption or the adaptations to the changes in behavioral cognitive pedagogy? Well, sometimes it's like putting a horse on front of a car, but there are more exciting ones as well. This is the open course library that now has 81 textbooks. It's funded by the Gates Foundation, but this is a community college system in Colorado. And they took their 80 largest courses out of all of their colleges. They had bids for who would develop the course, the textbook for this course, for that course. And they figure that they will save $41 million a year by doing that and cutting the high cost of textbooks out. And I think all of us institutions can do that. They do allow the commercial people to join in and to produce content, but they say it cannot cost more than $30. And you know many textbooks are $100 or $150, so it's quite a saving. This is the University of the People. It bills itself as the world's first tuition-free university. And the first course you take when you enroll in this is how to learn with other people and how to scaffold and support other people in your learning group, in your social network. So they help students to help themselves, and they use open educational resources. And they charge, I think, $30 to write the final exam. That's the only price that you have to pay. So you can see how threatening this kind of thing is. Like, you saw what Microsoft couldn't compete with encyclopedias, and can we compete with free universities? And I think that there's a number of examples that are coming. Oh, this is the Open University University. They talk about the free courses, but the quality assurance and the accreditation, that is the job of the institutions, rather than creating the content or even teaching it. Now, we talked this morning now, you know, what does this do? What is the role of the teacher, and how do you get teaching presence in this kind of an environment? And it's a very challenging question, because I don't think we really know. We've said teachers are really important because teachers are always there. If they're not there, can you still have a quality learning experience? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. So there are many ways that the first generation cognitive behavioralism still lives on. So let's move. I will get to connectivism. We've got to run through constructivism, which came afterwards from 1995 on. And it's built on completely different ideas on social validation. Rather than knowledge being something static that you can transfer, you have to help each individual learner to construct knowledge themselves. And you use the context, their prior knowledge. And it's really important that they have groups, multiple perspectives, and that they're actively involved in learning. So learning is located in the context and relationships rather than the minds of the individuals. So you're taking a big step into social learning concepts. And makes it, again, we have to start thinking about knowledge as being very complex and complicated. Wrong way. So constructivist learning is often and usually based on group-based learning, and we know that groups provide motivation, feedback, and alternative and conflicting viewpoints. And what's the result of that? This is from earlier studies, and it was done by Johnson & Johnson in the States, and it's, it was on face-to-face learning. But they were looking at not only is the effect size, which would translate, into a percentage of maybe 15% or so for one total, but so there, 10, 15% of difference in not only achievement, that people who work in groups learn more, but their interpersonal attraction to each other, their social support that they give raises, their self-esteem and how they feel about learning, the time that they spend on tasks goes up because they meet expectations of their colleagues and their coworkers, their attitude improves, the quality of their reasoning improves, and their capacity to take perspective learning takes place. So pretty strong arguments for why people should learn in groups. And the new tools have really revolutionized constructivist learning as well. All of the collaboration tools, whether from Google Circles to notifying people to, being transparent so you can see who's online, who's done this and done that. And then you get into all of the collaborative tools, the wikis, the concept maps, all of the kind of tools that are designed to help learners work together. And we get into tools now that are allowing us to build security and trust. We're developing networks that can sit behind firewalls if we want, or outside of them, so we can get mixtures of public and private. And decision-making and project management tools, that's one thing I've always found since I first started going online, is that group projects take twice as long to do as if you do it face-to-face. But that's because we didn't have good synchronous tools, we didn't have Second Life, we didn't have the kind of intensive decision-making capacity that we do have now. And things like Skype and it really is and so cheap and so free compared to what it was. So the capacity to run a group online has never been better than it is today. And the capacity to look at those groups. This is a tool from Australia called Snap. And it's designed to run on top of Moodle, but I think they're adapting it for other learning management systems as well. But there's a threaded conversation, and I know some of you have done content analysis of threaded discussions. It's long and it's boring, and you try to see what is the meaning that a teacher can extract from those lines. Well, they can sort of see who's talking and about what the topic is about, but that Snap tool turns it into networks, and you can see the person in the middle, likely the teacher, is the center of conversation, whereas you can see on the right there are 3 different diodes moving. And the nice thing about this particular tool is you don't have to ask your systems administrator to put it on the Moodle Insight. It runs on your own machine, and it just eats up the conversations that you can see and gives you network diagrams of it. So it helps teachers to understand what's really happening in their networks. And of course, we've got Second Life, and this is with Connect, where people movements, they hold these machines, instead of playing tennis or golf, they can actually talk and gesture and do all the things that people do. And this is, I drop in a couple of my favorite tools. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, but this is a shot of Voicethread. Oh, I forgot to even put the name of it. Anyways, it's voicethread.com. And if you're like our institution, we were really hung up on asynchronous interaction because we have to span 4.5 time zones in Canada, and our students are always working, so we didn't want to have a lot of synchronous stuff that would drag them down and make them meet at the same time. And so that usually meant that we didn't have any voice interaction because the voice talk is almost always synchronous. And then this tool came along, and what it does is you can put any kind of a diagram in the middle, and it can be a PowerPoint show or a photograph or a graph or whatever. And then people, as they come along on the side, they can add comments to it, they can write on it, they can talk with video or with audio or both. And they become asynchronous, so that the teacher might start out by talking about what this diagram means, and then having the students be challenged to give a counterexample or an example or something. And it will build up and build up and build up with all of the different people. So you can use the same environment over and over and over into different classes, and the exciting moments you might have in one class, you can reuse them, or you can edit them and kick some people out, or it's a very nice tool. Problem is, it's not open source, so I think we need to work together on creating a knockoff for a tool like this, because I think it could be really useful. But there's problems with groups. First, the restrictions in time again, and space and pace and relationship. Some people don't want to work in groups. They no thanks. Some of them would sooner slide along on other people's benefits, or they would sooner they think that they can work better and accomplish more on their own. So it challenges us and makes students, sometimes they have to give up some of their freedom to work in groups. They're often overly combined by the leader. That leader is usually the teacher. They're often isolated from the authentic world because the group or that you're working with in your school thing is not the group that you interact with in the real world of your work or your family or other situations. And so we get a culture built around a group that dissolves at the end of the school year, which isn't very productive or inducing of lifelong learning. There's also quite a bit of research on groupthink and how people start to think the same way, and the low tolerance within groups of individual differences, sexist and ethnicized, exercise regulation, high demand for obedience to the norm, and exclusivary practices. And another term, a colleague of mine coined this term, pathological politeness. When we first started going online, people were worried about people flaming and yelling at each other. And at least with Canadians, it just doesn't happen. But the opposite happens. They're so pathologically polite to each other that you never learn anything. You don't get any conflict. You don't get any real action happening. So groups have all of these problems that come along with them. And so constructivist learning in groups is probably necessary, although I've had arguments with people who say that hasn't been proven yet either. But it's very common, and it's a very comfortable way for us to learn. And it used to mean in classrooms. It now means actually better kinds of group learning can happen in online environments. So that brings us to the third generation, connectivism. And what learning here is not so much content, and it's not so much forming, new social connections and learning together in a group base, but rather it's building networks of information, context, and resources that you then apply to real problems. And it's built upon the fact that the world has changed and that networks are now predominant in society, that they not only network in the technical sense of the internet, but also networks of the contacts that people make with each other and form, and that these can and do span geography, and they span time as well. And so it creates new affordances for learners to create, connect, and repurpose information. You know, especially coming from our tradition at Athabasca of correspondence, all of our courses were designed that students would never get to talk to another student because they were at a different place and a different time, and they were going to different space. So we didn't have very many exams because the students would never talk. But then Facebook comes along, and they're all talking together, and they're saying what was on this exercise and that test, and it really just changed the context of learning for those old models. But this opportunity for learners to interact with other people outside of a mediating agent so that they can connect without the teacher, without the institution, and the fact that the sort of meta-knowledge we get from being able to read newspapers from around the world or watch YouTube or you name it. So the context is vastly different, and I'll argue that connectivism is really the first and major pedagogy that was designed with the network in mind. It was born after the networks were there. So the adjectives to describe it, it's networked, of course, as I said earlier. It's emergent, so that they don't talk so much about learning objectives, but what happens and how the learning is brought out of the contextual problems and the interactions that happen within it. And emergence is really an interesting idea. It's related to creativity and capacity for people to reach beyond the current knowledge that the teacher knows. And there is a special issue of the Erodal that's coming out at the end of this month on emergence, and there's about 6 articles that you might find of interest. It's chaotic, based on chaos theory, the idea that you cannot plan things strictly in advance like the behaviorist would have you do. You really have to encourage and be able to flow with what happens and be on the edge of chaos so that things can happen. But it's very disruptive. It's disruptive of institutions, it's disruptive of teachers, and it's disruptive of the way students think about learning and learning activities. The first person to coin it was George Siemens from Athabasca University in 2004. And this is a very famous article he's written that's been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times now. Learning is a process of connecting nodes of information sources, and those nodes can be people or they can be machines. It's sort of built with machine intelligence in mind. The capacity to know is more critical than what is currently known, and our objectives are to allow students to nurture and maintain their own connections, build their own networks, and keeping up currency is of vital importance. He had a few more, but I'm sure you've read that or heard of it. The connectivist depended upon networks, ubiquitous connectivity. It really thrives on people being different languages, different culture, different genders, different age groups. capacity and interest to form and join new networks, and the capacity that the artifacts that are created in a connectivist learning environment are put on the net and they're shared with other people. And they're usually, and they should be shared with a Creative Commons license so that people can rebuild them and improve upon them. This is a great quote from Ronald Burke, one of the guys on a social capital theorist from the States. And he says, people who live in the intersections of social worlds at a higher risk of having good ideas. And that's what we have to make sure our students are really at risk of bumping into things that would really, which even you as a teacher have never heard about. The technologies are all the Web 2.0 tools that I'm sure you're familiar with: file sharing, networking, mashups. It's emergent. I sort of talked about this already, but Sims has this special issue just coming out, so you might want to see that. Now, when you start talking about an instructional or a learning design for connectivism, it's almost an oxymoron. If you're talking about immersion all the time, then how can you design for emergence? And that's a challenge, but I think you can. And this is an Italian woman who wrote this kind of a model where it starts with making sure people are aware, because most people are not aware of all of the stuff that is relevant and interesting on the net, and they need to have time and they need to have tools and guidance in finding out what's there, seeing the nodes of information, and how to bookmark them, how to organize those connections as individuals. And the best way to do that is by selecting and filtering for each other. So your network becomes a way to take information and filter it. And I don't know how many of you have subscribed to Stephen Downes. He has a daily mail called the OL Online Learning Daily. And every single working day, Stephen sends an email out with about 6 or 7 links to various e-learning things. And he has about 2 or 3 sentences of his editorial and annotations. And there's a huge chunk of Stephen Downes's interpretation of life that comes along with each one of these links. And it's sometimes a little hard to take, but it's a filter for me, and it saves me having to do a lot of that kind of reading. So it's a really powerful example of how we can filter. And that's why I'm trying to get our students within our program, within our courses, to add social bookmarks, to filter for each other, to show each other how we can, different things that we can help and use from each other. And then you have to contribute and be involved, and that contribution, as I said, is almost always a digital artifact that you put out in the public net and license it, and then you reflect in metacognition. And the little arrows are just for the emergent things that come out all the time in these kind of designs. So it's a broad framework rather than a prescriptive design. And we really don't have really well-defined learning designs for connectivism yet. This is again from Stephen Downes. We have to create an environment and the expectations of great diversity, multiple points of view, amorphous body of material. And that's, of course, just the exact opposite of a behavior cognitive, who knows what the textbooks, what the readings, and knows everyone's going to read the same things. But here you're sort of creating and expecting students to read different things, but to be able to share those things. And creation of new and unexpected knowledge as a result of the interactions. Course activities are review and explore, often forming a short project group to filter, develop artifacts, network with other students, and then create and tag those artifacts. This is an example of a connectivist design that's running right now. It's called a MOOC, a Massive Open Online Course. This one is run by George Siemens and Stephen Downes and David Cormier. And this particular one, I think it's the 4th or 5th that George has run. And there are something like 3,000 people who are enrolled in this course. And it runs for a whole year. And so it's massive, and it's online, and it's open because it's free. And so you can join anytime you want. And they have synchronous activities in Illuminate, but there's no sort of a core center. And what Stephen wrote a tool that uses RSS to grab the blog and Twitter posts that are tagged with change 11 and aggregates them all together so that you don't have like a learning management system and a threaded discussion. You have all of these disparate pieces of information that are tagged together, and then people filter them and sort them and add graphic displays of the content. And it's all a little scary and a little like, is this real learning, or is this a real formal course, or what is exactly happening here? But it's worth exploring and participating in. But I wrote a blog post last night, or early this morning actually, where I titled it "Alienated from Change 11," and it was all about rhizomatic learning, or something that I didn't know very much about. But the presenter had this black screen out, and he said, "What is the purpose of education?" And there was about 50 people in the room, and they all started writing things. And the things they were writing were like, it's to give teachers jobs, it's to create soldiers, it's to create slave workers. And it was really such a left-wing political edupunk kind of explosion of stuff. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just too old, or maybe I've just been working for universities too long, or I just didn't get it very well. And so I wrote a blog post this morning, and I got a number of reactions you can see on my blog as well. But so it's interesting, and what it showed me too is just this is not the only way to use connectivism, but it's miles away from traditional formal education as it is today. And so it may be the perfect technology, but it's going to be a long time coming, and it needs a lot of development before it's going to be perfect for my institution anyways. Connectivist learning, and how do we do it in the institutions? We share, we cooperate, and there's an interesting distinction that Martin Paulson from NKI in Norway makes between cooperation and collaboration. And in the States and in North America, oftentimes teachers use those two terms interchangeably. But Martin is in an institution that is continuous enrollment too. And so what he wants to do is give opportunities for students to cooperate together, but not force them to collaborate, so that they get the freedom to set their own kind of agenda, and yet the freedom to cooperate when they want. And his idea is that we create compelling but not compulsory opportunities for cooperation. Building from small pieces, students find and build and put them together. And the teacher's role becomes one of a curator of the artifacts, and an organizer, and creating links, and creating a network of the students, of the archives, of the past students in those courses, and to aggregate them all together in some sort of a way, often using RSS, and providing defaults and templates, resources, technologies, methods, that sort of thing. And the content curation is becoming a big thing, not only amongst librarians, but among businesses, where they get content creators and content critics. That can be people in advertising, editorials. It can be anybody who is creating content about your product. And you take that and you tag it, you relate it, you contextualize it, you annotate it, and you create your brand by taking all this content, and you curate it, and you take care of that site. And then you can use it obviously for anything from selling washing machines to cars, but we can also do it for the particular area of knowledge that you're curating. And I think that's what we need to do as teachers. Not leave that to librarians or experts, but to create these little nodes that every year our students continue to build and add to the content that we are a world specialist in. And that can be very small. And you can do it on a public system, even like Wikipedia, or you can be more elaborate and do it on your own. But if you license it and link it, then it can be used by everyone around the world. It's very important to talk about transparency, so that you can see what other people are doing, shared awarenesses. So otherwise, uncoordinated groups can see each other, can find each other. And when you do that, you bump into what the economist Stuart Kaufman talks about, the adjacent possibilities, that as soon as you find out or make a connection to somebody or something, then you're more likely to be able to find something connected to them, and theirs connected to somebody else. And we start weaving these paths of knowledge construction, and they conceptually propel interaction, contradictions, and adoption. There was a special issue just this spring, edited by George Siemens and Vanya Knoll. And this has some very interesting articles, some of the most downloaded articles that we've published in Erodal. And I'm just going to end by talking about some work that John Drawn and I have been doing about talking about the social organizations and how they relate to those three generations. And this is what I learned from Randy Garrison. He was my PhD supervisor, and he said he's made his whole career on Venn diagrams. Only three things and how they connect: social presence, teaching presence, cognitive. And so I had to follow that model. But we talk about nets, sets, and groups, and I'll show you how they connect with each of these three generations. So the behaviorist cognitive self-paced study, individual study, that's really an individual act and maybe interlapping slightly with groups. And groups, of course, are the basis for social constructivism, classes. And connectivism is dealing with nets. And I'll just talk about sets a little bit in the next few slides. But we're talking about that you need all four of those in sort of a holistic where you use all of these together. And here's some examples. This is the group model of Moodle. Membership and is exclusive and closed, hierarchies of control. Groups are great for trust building and for motivating people together and for transparency of knowing where other students are. We get to nets, and we get to things like the Change MOOC, bottom-up, inclusive. And not everyone knows that they're a member, who's a member of their network. Network activity is very bursty. It happens, it goes up, you have a big talk, and then it goes down, and then it comes up again. And what is the role of the teacher? It's mostly as a role model and a co-traveler within the network learning environment, and the focus on the individual and connections. And then sets are something that we're just starting to exploit, but it's the idea that you see it in analytics a lot. But you know, like on Amazon books, if you buy many books from Amazon, pretty soon they have, I go in and it shows me Terry's bookshelf, and it's got all the books that I have bought, and then it's got all of the books they think I should buy. And how do they know that? Because the people who bought this book are the people who bought that book. And it's amazing how accurate it is, and how what good ideas they have for me to spend to get the old credit card out by looking at their recommendations. And their recommendations get better and better and better the more people using it, because they're finding the set of people who like this book are also intermingling with the set who like that book. And you can think of other filtering and selection devices. And we use sets, you know, just like all the people who, you know, are 6 years old get sent to grade 1, and or all the people who are this gender or that gender. And we start thinking of, we use sets all the time, but we've often not been able to articulate those people and then make decisions based on the kind of set behavior that's happening, mostly because it was very difficult to gauge that in the past. But we can find people who tag different things with different labels, and find sets of people who like this category, or sets of people who finished in 10 minutes compared to those who finished in 20 minutes, and devise different interactions for them. And so then the holistic model is just trying to build a learning and context that has a place for groups, it has a place for individual learning, and it's got a place for networks and a place for sets. And that's what we're trying to build, and this is the tool example I'll just show you here. Welcome to Val. I'd love to demonstrate it another day, but it's based on the ELG platform. The challenges of connectivism, as if I haven't mentioned a few of them already, privacy is a huge one. Just how can you be transparent, and yet we have people who really don't want to have any net presence. And it could be for valid reasons, that they have an abusive partner who's stalking them, ex-partner, or it can be for paranoid reasons, or for whatever reasons. But if your whole educational model is based on transparency and finding connections, and some people don't want to be on the net, then how can they participate in this kind of an education? So we have to find ways to protect privacy and allow individuals the freedom to set the privacy levels that they want. And you can't have one privacy level that works for everyone, because what's private and secure for one person is curtailing the freedom of speech of another person, and sometimes at different points in your life. And I want to release things to certain people, like some of my buddies, but I don't want my mother to read these things, you know, and you see that in Facebook all over the place where they're not fine-tuned and people are releasing the wrong stuff to the wrong people all the time. Control issues, it's really hard to find and to control a connectivist learning activity because it happens outside of the institutional control, most of the learning. It's very disruptive, and getting institutions, our institution is, you know, if once they got Moodle up, they thought, that's it, that's the end of our technical support for learning. And we say, you gotta be kidding, we haven't got any Web 2.0 tools supported, and you're at the end? And it's just a constant battle between allowing because they're concerned about security and privacy and data protection, and we're concerned about opening up, and so there's all those challenges. Sustaining motivation and commitment of students, you know, it does both develop and rely on a lot more self-reliant learning, which is, again, what we need for lifelong learning, but many of our students have not had much practice. And reduced teaching presence is something that both teachers and students often don't like. So lots of change theory stuff, you know, we have to unfreeze change and refreezing old stuff from the 1950s. And how do you do that? By imitation, adoption. Adaption's the perfect way that it should work. It often is very challenging. And one of the big challenge is that you can talk to all of the people who are in the edupunks and the people who are in the MOOCs right now. They're all technology enthusiasts and visionaries. And there's this huge chasm. This is Jeffrey Moore's book on crossing the chasm. But, you know, we can spend our whole lives amuse ourselves because over the pragmatists, the conservatives, and the skeptics are a long ways from getting over there. So that's our challenge, is to not just you know work in that left hand with all the buddies who think like we think. How do you do that? This is old too. In 1980, Edward Rogers talks about diffusion of innovation. And he says that you have to show value and relative advantage, that students and teachers really need to see concrete examples of how this can really make a difference, save them time, and you know, really, you know, help them to be better teachers and better learners. We have to promote, demonstrate, be transparent, do these kind of talks. Demonstrate compatibility so that it's not that weird, it's not that different. You don't have to go 100% into connectivism. You can just have a connectivist learning activity as part of your course sort of thing. We have to scaffold and help them to trial, and we have to try to reduce complexity. And maybe that's the biggest challenge, but fortunately these technologies are becoming less complex, I think, at least from the user interface all the time. So this is a shot of the ELG tool that we use, Athabasca Landing. And it's got blogs and wikis and social bookmarking and photos and all those sorts of things. And it's got groups. Then groups can be private or they can be public. And it's bottom-up control in that anybody can form a group. You don't have to be a teacher or an administrator. Oh, I'm missing a meeting. Sorry. Oh, now how am I going to turn that on? This is the second last slide. Yes, our landing help community is meeting. This is the Friends of the Landing, but I've taken care of it. I've got somebody else looking after it. I don't know exactly how to turn that on, but it doesn't matter. It's the second last slide. And I think it'll go away. But what I wanted to show you is that everything that you post into this landing here, you get to decide who gets to read it. And that can be from a picture to a blog post to a Twitter page to whatever, wiki. And it can be private, so nobody gets to see it, or people you are following, that's like friends in Facebook, only it's not reciprocal, it's like Twitter. And the default is logged in users, and logged in users are everyone within the Athabasca community. That's staff and faculty and students and graduates and alumni, but it's a boutique world. It's not for everybody. It's designed specifically as something that's a special place for people within our community. And we have challenges because some people say, well, that's not really open, but this is our experiment to try to see if we can create something that's sort of semi-open. But if, as you go down, they can make it public, and that means that Google search engine can find it, and we've now made it so that other people, if you make it open, then other people from around the world can comment or add things to it. They just can't start their own new threads or discussions. But then they can get all kinds of groups and sets. You can have the set of people who are my graduate students, or the set of people who like baseball or anything, and anybody can create any kind of sets that they want. And then you have all of the groups, and those can be course groups, they can be the Friends of the Landing, they can be any kind of a group. So I think that's one of the only really powerful solutions to the privacy issue, is to give the user the control and to decide how they want to share that information. Okay, so the summary, I'm going to have to get rid of that. Cognitive behaviors theory. This is from an article that John and I wrote. It was published in Arodal this year. But you can see the technologies, the learning activities, the granularity going from the individual to the group to the network, how you evaluate, and what the teacher's role. And notice, remember I talked about the value of scalability. The cognitive behaviors model, the print correspondence package, was very scalable. That's what the mega universities of the world, they're running with hundreds of thousands of students, and they run on cognitive behaviors pedagogy by and large. And it's the only affordable one, really, at the present time. Constructivism, we get, so that, you hardly ever hear of a constructivist class that's more than 40 people. And can they scale beyond that? Some of our teachers have a heart attack if you talk about 40 students. They think, oh, it's just impossible, But with the earlier models, we were doing 4,000, 400,000 students. So we've gone down in terms of affordability and scalability. And connectivism, it's very interesting. I mean, there are 3,000 people who've enrolled in this MOOC that's running right now. Are they really there? There was about 60 who were on last night at the Illuminate talk. So are they just browsing, and peripheral participation, is that good enough? And what did they contribute? And there's lots of research going on this MOOC and many other MOOCs. So if you want to follow it, I describe each of those in the article. So to conclude, behavioral cognitive models are useful, especially for memory and conceptual model knowledge acquisition. Constructivist models develop group skills and trust, and connectivist models introduce network learning and are foundational for lifelong learning in very complex contexts. And I think that 21st century literacies demand all of those three pedagogies. And don't try to argue with those from different generations about which one is best, because you just get into all sorts of arguments that go nowhere. So that article was translated and is available in Spanish. And if you're interested, I'm interested in any comments or questions or any discussion. So thank you for your attention.